Winter returned once more. Snow covered the trails where the barrels had rested. The forest looked pure, yet I knew better. Beneath the white lay soil that had swallowed secrets. I walked slowly past the tree line. My breath formed clouds that drifted into silence. The park was empty. No hunters, no hikers, only me. My footsteps sank deep into the snow like echoes of the past. In my bag, I carried photographs of the victims. Their faces reconstructed by science looked back at me. A mother, children, fragments of a family erased. I laid the photos against the trunk of a pine and stood in silence. The case file remained in my office, but the truth lived here. Each gust of wind sounded like a voice. Each branch shifting overhead felt like a question. The forest itself had become my witness. I thought of the drifter and his many names. He was gone, yet his shadow stretched across states and years. People who once lived beside him never knew his secret. He hid barrels while pretending to be ordinary. But was he the only one? I could not shake the thought. Heavy barrels, deep woods, so much silence. Could one man have done it all without help? My journal filled with unfinished lines. There is another hand unseen. The forest keeps count. The barrels are not done. Words written in the dark of night when doubts grow loud. The department wanted the file closed. To them, the killer was known and the victims named. But closure on paper did not close the voices in the trees. I refused to stamp the word final. Sometimes I imagined more barrels buried deeper, not in Bear Brook, but in other woods, other states. Each town with its own silent trail. Each family still waiting for names. I wondered if I had walked past one without knowing. A patch of soil, a mound of leaves, a rusted lid hidden under moss. The thought made me scan every shadow. The years pressed down on me. My hair gray, my hands stiff, but my eyes still searching. I no longer expected full answers. I only wanted truth to remain alive. On my last visit to the park, I stood at the trailhead as the sun set. Light bled through the trees in streaks of red. The woods grew darker with each step, yet I walked forward. I reached the place where the first barrel had rested. Snow melted into soft earth under my boots. I touched the ground with my gloved hand and whispered the names again. The forest answered with silence. Silence that could mean peace. Silence that could mean warning. Silence that could mean the killer was not alone. I turned back toward the road as night fell. My flashlight flickered against the trees. In the distance, I thought I saw the glint of metal, half hidden in snow. I did not walk closer. Some mysteries are not meant to be finished. Some truths remain in the dark, waiting for another hand to uncover them. The barrels taught me that. And so the forest remains. The case was marked cold again, yet it never felt cold to me. Files sat in boxes, but the images burned bright in my memory. The barrels, the bones, the torn clothing. None of it ever left. Years had passed since the last discovery. Technology had given us fragments of truth. We knew the victims had names, though some were still missing. We knew the killer had lived among us under false faces. But knowledge is not justice. A dead man cannot stand trial. A name on a report cannot answer why. My badge felt powerless each time I signed the word unresolved. I visited the park more often now. The trail had grown familiar like an old scar. Hikers passed by with dogs, unaware of what had happened here. I watched them disappear into the trees and felt the weight of silence press closer. I knelt by the soil where the barrels once lay. My hand brushed pine needles and damp earth. I whispered the names of the victims we had uncovered. The woods absorbed the sound without reply. At the station, younger officers asked why I still returned. They said the case was finished. They said the killer was identified. But I told them truth is not so simple. What if he had not acted alone? What if more barrels lay hidden deeper in the forest? What if another man with another name had watched and helped? The thought gnawed at me every night. In my journal, I wrote, "Resolution is a lie. Closure is a word for paperwork, not for truth." My handwriting slanted as if even the page resisted the weight. The journal grew thicker with each entry. Sometimes I dreamed of sitting across from him. No jury, no lawyers, only silence. I asked him why, and he never answered. He only smiled, and the smile woke me in cold sweat. One autumn evening, I walked the trail at dusk. The air smelled of smoke from distant fires. My flashlight beam caught a glint of metal half buried in soil. My heart leapt though my hands shook. It was only an old can crushed by time. Yet in that moment, I felt the forest mocking me. Every shadow looked like a barrel waiting to be found. I turned away, but the image stayed. The community moved on long ago. New houses, new families, new children. Few remembered the barrels or spoke of the victims. Only I carried them forward. Reporters no longer called. Headlines had faded. But sometimes I caught strangers on true crime shows speaking of the case. They spoke of barrels and bones as if telling a campfire story. I switched off the screen. My own family grew distant. My children no longer asked about my work. They knew the barrels had stolen me long ago. My wife spoke less each year. Silence spread in our home like fog. Still, I searched through archives. Each box of paper a possible clue. Old receipts, driver licenses, photographs. Somewhere in the dust, I hoped for a voice. One night, I found a document with a faint signature. The name did not match his known aliases, yet the handwriting felt familiar. Was it another mask? Or was I seeing ghosts where none existed? I could never be sure. The drifter's name echoed in my mind, though it was never the same twice. He shifted identities like a snake shedding skin. Each alias carried a different history. Each paper trail ended in silence. I searched through forgotten boxes in county offices. Old photographs curled at the edges. Employment forms signed with different names bore the same handwriting. The man's presence lingered in every page, yet slipped away again. Detectives argued whether to release his photo to the public. Some feared false leads, others wanted answers. I wanted to see if a neighbor might recall a detail. Memory might be our last weapon. When the image reached the news phones rang in the station, voices claimed they had seen him in bars, on construction sites, at roadside diners. The stories painted a picture of a man who existed everywhere and nowhere. I followed one lead into the mountains. A woman said she had known him briefly. She remembered a child with dark eyes who vanished one night. She never asked questions then, but her face filled with regret now. The more I listened, the more I saw a pattern. Children left behind, partners abandoned, identities switched. He moved like a storm tearing through quiet lives. The barrels in the forest were only part of his weight. My nights grew longer. I read every report under dim light. Coffee went cold as I traced timelines across maps. His presence stretched from coast to coast. The scope felt too wide for one man, yet the evidence was clear. We gathered in a briefing room. Charts covered walls. Photographs formed constellations. Arrows pointed from state to state. At the center stood the man with many names. A younger officer asked if we had enough to close the file. I stared at the board before answering. Closure required truth, not speculation. We had fragments, but not the whole picture. I visited the park again. The trail had grown over yet. I still knew where to step. My boots pressed into the same soil. I imagined the barrels resting beneath once more. The forest held memories like scars. Trees had grown taller, roots had spread, but in my mind, the barrels remained sealed in the dark. No growth could erase them. A storm rolled in that evening. Rain hammered the leaves, and mud swallowed my boots. Thunder echoed across the hills. I stood alone in the downpour, feeling the weight of every unanswered question. Later that week, forensic results confirmed more links. The victims in the barrels were connected by blood. The drifter was tied through genetic threads. The science told us what witnesses could not. Yet questions remained. Why these victims? Why this place? Why barrels in the woods? Motive remained hidden. Without motive, the story felt incomplete. I drove through small towns searching for traces. In diners, I listened to old men talk. In gas stations, I watched faces for recognition. No one spoke his name, but fear lived in silence. Sometimes I wondered if others had helped him. Barrels were heavy, the woods deep. Could one man have done it alone? The thought kept me awake at night. At the station, I found myself staring at the map again. Pins marked every place he had lived. Red lines stretched like veins across the country. I followed them with my finger until I felt dizzy. A call came from another state. Remains had been found years ago with no identity. Forensic testing now suggested a link to him. The pattern widened. The storm grew. I told my chief that the case would never truly close. He frowned but said resources had limits. I nodded, yet inside, I refused to stop. Some truths demand pursuit regardless of order. At home, my wife asked why I carried the case like a chain. I told her the victims had no one else. Without us, they would vanish again. She looked at me with sadness, but said nothing more. One night I sat alone in my car near the park. Headlights off, windows open, listening to the forest. The air smelled of pine and rain. I imagined footsteps in the dark, though none came. In my journal I wrote, "The killer is dead, yet he breathes through the silence he left. His barrels speak louder than his voice ever did." My pen scratched hard against the page. I dreamed again of more barrels buried deeper. In the dream, I dug until my hands bled. Each lid I opened revealed another face I did not know. Waking left me trembling. The case turned me into a ghost in my own home. I ate in silence, spoke little, drifted through rooms. My family noticed, yet did not confront me. They knew the barrels haunted me more than words could describe. Still, I pressed on. I called distant relatives of the victims. Some wanted answers. Some wanted distance. Pain echoed in their voices, like a wound reopened. I carried their grief as part of my own. As weeks turned into months, the board filled with more lines. The picture grew clearer, yet never complete. A puzzle with missing pieces that might never be found. I stood again at the trailhead of Bear Brook. Families walked past smiling. Children ran ahead without fear. I envied their ignorance. They did not see barrels in the shadows. The sun dipped behind the trees. Darkness spread quickly. I lit a flashlight and whispered to the woods. The case was not finished. The forest knew more than it told. And so the confrontation remained not with the killer, but with silence itself. Years after the first barrel, I found myself staring at new files on my desk. The papers were fresh, but the feeling was the same. Another cold case team wanted to review the evidence. They asked me to sit in as the officer who had been there at the start. New technology entered the room. DNA analysis had advanced beyond what we once believed possible. Computers compared fragments across distant databases. For the first time in decades, there was a chance of progress. The lab sent partial profiles. A connection suggested the victims were related, likely a mother and her children. That single line in the report made my chest tighten. We studied photographs again. Rusty barrels, torn clothing, broken shoes. The same images I had carried for years now felt alive with possibility. A chance to give them names. Investigators searched genealogy networks. Strangers who had uploaded DNA for curiosity now offered silent clues. Each match was weak, but together they formed a path. The victims might have come from the West Coast. I drove long hours to interview distant relatives. Old photographs hung on walls. Faces blurred by time bore resemblance to the sketches on my board. People spoke carefully, yet some shed quiet tears. Each interview reminded me of the weight of years lost. Families fractured, children grown, parents buried. The victims had been missing for decades, while life had moved on. Closure felt both cruel and necessary. Back in New Hampshire, the woods seemed unchanged. Pines stood tall. Trails wound through silence. Yet I felt the forest pushing back as if it wanted to keep it secret. My flashlight cut through shadows, but revealed nothing new. The case demanded travel. We followed leads across states. Motel rooms and gas stations became routine. Each night, I dreamed of barrels waiting in new places. One night, a tip arrived about a drifter. A man who worked under different names, who left behind broken families. Records placed him in New Hampshire, around the time of the first barrel. The coincidence burned in my mind. We dug through old employment records. He had worked in mills and construction, always moving, always leaving before questions began. His trail was a smear across the map. I stared at his mugshot. The face looked ordinary, forgettable. That was the danger. A man who blended in could hide barrels in the woods and vanish. The more I studied his eyes, the colder I felt. We checked old addresses. Some houses still stood. Others had been torn down. Neighbors remembered a man who kept to himself. Few details, no certainty. Memory faded like photographs in sunlight. The deeper we looked, the stranger it grew. The drifter had used multiple names. He had children in different states. Some had vanished without explanation. The pattern was impossible to ignore. I wrote in my journal that night, "A man without a true name leaves shadows instead of history. He hides his crimes by hiding himself." My pen pressed deep into the page. We tested more samples. Another victim identified. Another line connected. The barrels no longer held strangers. They were women and children with stories, with faces, with unfinished lives. But the killer remained Smoke. He had died years before, in a prison under one of his false names. His body was gone, his secrets buried with him. We had answers, yet no confrontation. The lack of closure angered me. To stand at the trail, knowing the killer would never face trial, felt like defeat. The victims had been found, yet justice slipped away. My badge felt heavier than ever. Still, the public wanted certainty. Cameras returned. Reporters asked if the case was solved. I gave statements careful with words. Solved was not the word I wanted. A dead suspect cannot answer questions. At home, my wife asked if I felt relief. I told her no. Relief comes with truth, and truth was still incomplete. We had fragments of identity, but not the full story. Each night, I imagined the moment of the murders. The barrels being filled, sealed, rolled into the forest. I tried to see his face as he worked. I wondered if he felt fear or satisfaction. Cold cases never end clean. They bleed into the lives of those who touch them. I carried the victims with me in every step. I carried the killer too, faceless yet always present. I drove to the storage site where the barrels once sat. Only photographs remained now. The real barrels had been disposed of after evidence was secured. I ran my hand over the photo as if touching the rust. The forest at Bear Brook stood silent once more. Birds sang, children laughed, hikers passed. None of them knew what lay beneath the soil years before. Only I carried that silence forward. At night, the silence grew louder. I imagined more barrels buried deeper, still waiting to be found. I told myself it was paranoia, yet the thought lingered. What if we had only scratched the surface? The drifter's past suggested other crimes. States where he had lived remained unsearched. Families who never received answers might still wait. The case stretched beyond New Hampshire, like a shadow across the nation. My superiors spoke of closure. It wanted to mark the file resolved. I refused to write that word. Resolved meant silence, and silence was never justice. The forest still had a voice unheard. I returned to the trail once more. The same tree line, the same soil. I placed my hand on the ground where the barrels once lay. Cold earth pressed back, and I whispered to myself, "Not yet." Winter came, and the park turned white. Snow lay heavy on the trees, and trails disappeared under frozen sheets. I patrolled the area, and each gust of wind carried a memory of the barrels. Silence in the snow felt sharper than silence in summer. The case file grew thicker with reports. Old leads filled pages, yet none reached the truth. Each theory ended in a dead end. My handwriting grew tighter, as if pressure could squeeze meaning from nothing. Sometimes we received anonymous tips. People claimed to know a man who worked with barrels in the 80s. Others said they saw a stranger driving through the park late at night. We checked every detail, but evidence never matched. One evening I sat in the evidence room. The smell of dust and old paper surrounded me. Photographs of the remains stared back from yellow folders. I wondered if the victims still wanted their story told. I drove the back roads near the park. Houses looked small against the tall pines. Curtains moved as I passed, and I thought of the fabric found in the barrel. Somewhere an ordinary object had become part of murder. Detectives argued about motive. Some believed it was domestic violence hidden in the forest. Others spoke of a drifter who traveled state to state. I listened but held no clear belief. The truth felt more personal than random. When the second barrel was found, my world shifted again. The child inside the barrel left an image I could never erase. I carried that image like a shadow. My reports became colder, yet my mind burned with anger. Technology promised help, yet years kept slipping away. Fingerprints never surfaced. Dental comparisons failed. The remains had waited too long in the dark. Science could not keep up with time. I stood at the site many nights after work. Flashlight beam cut through the trees. My breath formed clouds against the air. I pictured the killer rolling heavy barrels across soil. No one heard, no one saw. Small towns hold secrets close. We asked about missing families, yet silence greeted us. People avoided eye contact as if memory was dangerous. Fear or loyalty, I could not tell. My own fear deepened. Every sound in the woods reminded me of footsteps. Every shadow looked like a figure carrying something heavy. I stayed longer at the station just to avoid the lonely road home. Forensics once sent me a sketch. The victims might have been a mother and her children. Bones suggested ages and relations, yet names still escaped us. The sketch hung on the wall of my office. Looking at the drawing, I thought of my own family. A woman and children erased without trace. Someone cared enough to kill, yet not enough to claim responsibility. That cruelty disturbed me most. In the evenings, I reviewed my notes. I traced timelines of missing people across counties. Most cases did not fit, yet I kept the files. My board filled with maps and strings, like a web of unanswered questions. Colleagues teased me for obsession. They said the case would never close. But I remembered the weight of the first barrel and could not stop. To walk away felt like betrayal. The press returned every few years. They asked if new evidence had surfaced. Cameras caught my tired face as I said we were still investigating. I hated those interviews more than silence. One day, a woman visited the station. She said her sister had vanished years ago with 2 children. She looked at photographs, but shook her head. Not her family, she whispered. Hope dissolved in the air. Sometimes at night, I dreamed of barrels multiplying in the woods. I walked through rows of them, each sealed, each heavy. The lids never opened, yet I knew what lay inside. Waking up left me drenched in sweat. We tried psychological profiles. Experts spoke of organized killers who plan with care. They described a man who blends into community life, The description fit too many faces. When I drove through town, I scanned every yard. Barrels stood near barns and sheds. Ordinary objects that once stored food or trash now looked sinister. I wondered how many secrets hid in plain sight. One spring we drained a nearby pond. Divers searched mud for more barrels. Nothing surfaced except old tires and bottles. Relief mixed with disappointment. The case haunted every new recruit. They heard my story during training. Some asked too many questions, while others avoided the subject. The barrels became a test of endurance. Family holidays grew strained. My wife saw the distance in my eyes. She told me to let go, yet I could not. Each year without answers felt heavier. I kept a journal outside of reports. In it, I wrote thoughts not suited for official files. Questions about motive, fragments of dreams, sketches of the forest. The journal became a private witness. One entry read, "The barrels waited because he knew time would protect him." Another said, "The woods remember even when people forget." My words sounded strange, yet they captured my state of mind. When I walked the trail again, I saw children playing near the entrance. Parents smiled, unaware of what had happened deeper inside. I wondered if truth should remain hidden for their sake. But duty demanded pursuit. I reopened old maps and noted every property near the park. Owners had changed hands many times. I knocked on doors and asked questions met with wary stares. A man once told me he heard trucks in the woods late at night in the 80s. He thought it was logging or hunters. He never reported it then. I thanked him, but the lead went nowhere. I considered the barrels themselves. Industrial grade, sealed tight, placed with precision. Whoever used them knew how to handle such containers. That knowledge narrowed suspects, yet never pointed to one. Each season returned me to the same place. The trail, the tree line, the memories. Snow melted into mud, then dried into dust. The barrels stayed present in my mind, even as the forest changed. I aged with the case. Hair turned gray, hands less steady, yet the file remained on my desk. Younger officers moved on, but I stayed bound to the mystery. Sometimes I thought of the killer still walking free, living quietly in some town, mowing a yard, waving to neighbors. A man who had rolled barrels into the woods, then disappeared into ordinary life. That thought chilled me more than any ghost story. The victims deserved their names back. That belief guided me through long nights. I did not know when or how, but I held on to hope. The forest would not remain silent forever. And so I waited. The forest was quiet that morning. Cold air pressed against my uniform as I stepped out of the car. Pine needles broke under my boots with a dry snap. The state park looked empty, yet it felt as if something heavy lingered in the shadows. A hunter had called in a strange report. He said there was a barrel hidden off the trail. I followed his path marked with boot tracks and broken twigs. Each step took me deeper into silence until I saw the faded metal cylinder lying against a tree. The barrel looked ordinary at first glance. Its blue paint had worn away and rust spread like disease. Yet the lid was sealed tight with tape and wire. My hand reached for the metal, and I smelled the faint odor of decay. Training told me to stop. I called for backup and waited while staring at that barrel. Sunlight cut through the branches, yet the air turned foul. When another officer arrived, we forced the lid open. Inside lay the remains of 2 bodies. Cloth wrapped around bones and fragments of hair still clung to a skull. My throat tightened, but I kept steady notes. The hunter had been right to call. We marked the scene with tape and photographs. The woods looked normal, yet now every tree felt hostile. I scanned the ground for shoe prints, yet the soil was too dry. The barrel must have been placed there years ago. The coroner's van arrived with little ceremony. I helped lift the heavy cylinder into the back. Flies buzzed, and the smell clung to our gloves. When the van drove off, the silence returned, but I felt different. That night, I wrote my report in the station. Words came slowly as I tried to keep emotion away. 2 unidentified victims inside a single barrel in a family park. Nothing about it made sense. The next morning, detectives questioned hikers and locals. No one knew of missing people in the area that fit the case. The park staff looked pale as they answered routine questions. The forest had become a crime scene overnight. Weeks turned into months. Forensics struggled with degraded evidence. No fingerprints, no clear dental records, no quick answers. I carried the photographs in my case folder like heavy stones. Every time I passed Bear Brook Park, I thought of the barrel. The case sat open on my desk, yet nothing moved forward. The victims had no names and no history to trace. They were ghosts trapped in metal. Rumors spread in town. Some said it was drug-related. Others whispered about out-of-state killers. I listened but never agreed. The truth felt stranger than gossip. Years passed. Then another discovery shook us. Another barrel appeared near the same spot. The call reached me late in the afternoon, and I drove fast, though I already knew what waited. The second barrel held more remains. This time a child's small bones pressed against torn fabric. I stared at them longer than I should have, and tried to imagine the face. My report that night shook under my hand. Now the puzzle grew darker. 2 barrels, 4 victims, 1 forest. Whoever had placed them had done it with purpose. The barrels had waited years before being found. The media swarmed, and the town filled with fear. I watched cameras flash near the trail, while families hurried their children away. My badge drew questions I could not answer. The case grew colder even as attention grew hotter. At home, I found myself checking doors twice. The thought of a killer hiding victims in the woods unsettled me more than I admitted. I lived close enough to feel exposed. The line between duty and fear blurred. Every detail replayed in my mind. Rust on the barrel, the way the lid stuck, the fragments of clothing. I memorized the smell, though I wished I could forget. My dreams often returned me to that first discovery. We consulted outside experts. Anthropologists studied bone growth. Chemists studied hair and tooth enamel. They told us the victims had likely lived in the region. That fact made the mystery even heavier. How could 4 people disappear without notice? How could no one report missing children or a missing mother? The silence of the community grew louder than any statement. It felt as though the forest had swallowed them whole. The lead detective retired, yet I stayed with the file. Each year new hands looked at it, then gave up. I held on because I had been there at the start. A memory chained me to the case. One photograph showed a small shoe fragment. Another showed a piece of curtain cloth. I kept them pinned to a board near my desk. Small clues that refused to speak. The barrels themselves became infamous evidence, stored away under lock and cataloged in photographs. I visited them once in storage and stared at the rust. It was like looking at a closed mouth that would never open. As time moved forward, new technology emerged. DNA databases expanded. Still, the samples were degraded. I mailed them to labs, yet results came back thin. Each report felt like another locked door. The families of the unknown victims never came forward. We had no names to trace. I imagined someone out there wondered what happened to a sister or daughter, yet never called. The silence was painful to bear. My own children grew up during these years. Each time they played in the yard, I thought of the child in the barrel. I hid my fear, but it lived inside me. Cases like this change how you see the world. The town eventually adjusted. People walked the trails again, and children rode bikes near the park. But for me, the woods never looked safe again. The trees reminded me of the barrel and what waited inside. Some colleagues told me to let it go. Cold cases pile up and time erases leads. But I could not forget the weight of lifting that first barrel. It was more than evidence. It was a burden I carried. Every anniversary of the discovery, I returned to the park. I walked the same trail the hunter had walked. I stood by the place where the barrel had rested. I waited for the forest to whisper something I could use.